Welcome back to Human Biology with Dr. B. Today we're talking about the urinary system. There are four major organs associated with the urinary system. We have the kidneys, which play the largest role in the urinary system, and everything else is basically just storage and conduction. We have the ureters that transport the urine from the kidneys to the bladder. The urinary bladder is where it is stored until you feel the urge to use the restroom. And then the urethra is what transports the urine from the bladder to the toilet. So the kidney is the main structure that allows us to pull all of the waste from our blood and allows us to form urine. There are three regions. There is the cortex, the medulla, and the pelvis. Now, if you look over here, let me find my cursor. Here is the cortex. The cortex is always the most external portion. And then we have the renal medulla. And then we have the pelvis. And the pelvis is where each of the collecting ducts from the nephron over here, which is the functional unit of the kidney, it's where all the collecting ducts come together. And when we get here, we form the urine. It travels down the ureter and is stored in the urinary bladder. So let's talk about the nephron. The nephron is the microscopic functional unit of the kidney. And what the nephron does is it pulls things out of the blood using the blood pressure, things being solutes, high concentration of salt, etc., pulls these out of the blood so that we can maintain homeostasis. There's two major parts of the nephron. There is the corpuscle and the tubule. The corpuscle is the site of filtration, and filtration is the main part of, it's the main role of the nephron. So as you can see over here, we have the afferent and the efferent. We have the coming in and the going out. And here we have the capillary bundle. This right here is what we call the glomerulus. And this is a tuft of capillaries. And then around it, we have the glomerular capsule, which is also called the Bowman's capsule because Dr. Bowman discovered it, and for no other reason than that. So what happens is the blood comes in, and we've talked about the blood pressure. And as the blood comes in, there's this filtering effect as all of the fluid and solutes, small, tiny solutes, are pushed into the capsule. And we now call this the filtrate. Then the filtrate moves from here into, it goes behind here, as you can see this. This is called the proximal convoluted tubule. It's called the proximal convoluted tubule because it is convoluted and it is close to the glomerulus. That's pretty much it. Within the tubule, we have the proximal convoluted tubule right here, and we have the distal convoluted tubule right here. And these are the main sites of absorption and secretion. Now, when we're talking about the nephron, the words absorption and secretion can be misunderstood. So when we talk about absorption, we're talking about the blood reabsorbing from the fluid. And when we're talking about secretion, we're talking about things, solutes, being moved from the blood into the filtrate so that we can have concentrated urine so we don't literally pee ourselves to death. So the renal tubule is right here. We have the proximal tubule and the distal tubule. We have the proximal convoluted tubule. We then have the loop of the nephron, also called the loop of Henle, because guess who? Dr. Henle discovered it. And we have the distal convoluted tubule. Now, the nephron accomplishes these three main functions using all four of the main parts that we just discussed about the nephron. We do glomerular filtration, we have tubular absorption, and then we have tubular secretion. And all of these are under hormonal control, as we will talk about at the end of the lecture. So glomerular, say that 10 times fast. Go ahead, you try it. Glomerular filtration. Here we have glomerular filtration. Here we have the afferent coming in. And here is our glomerulus, this big tuft of capillaries. And then we have the efferent, which is returning. Now, within this glomerulus, the blood pressure of the blood as it's coming in forces water ion small molecules from the blood into the capsular space. And this is what we call the net filtration effect of the nephron. And when this happens, I believe it's about 70%, maybe 80% of the water of everything in the blood is pushed out. And all that remains in the blood at this point are the red blood cells, proteins, larger solutes like glucose. As we talked about in our lab, glucose in the urine is a sign of large problems. So then we get to the tubular reabsorption because we've just pushed all the water out into the capsule. So now we're going to move into the proximal convoluted tubule and reabsorb all of it. So the tubular reabsorption, this pulls all the useful materials from the filtrate. So you have to think of it not in the blood anymore, it's in the tube. So everything that's useful to the body is now moved from the filtrate into the blood because we literally don't want to pee ourselves to death. So about 99% of the filtrate is then returned to the blood through the process of reabsorption in the proximal convoluted tubule, the loop of Henle, and then the distal convoluted tubule. The things that are reabsorbed are water, essential ions, sodium, potassium, magnesium, as well as glucose. And we don't want to be peeing glucose out because that tells us we have larger problems. And then we also have tubular secretion, so we can increase the concentration of the urine so we don't lose all of our water. Because as we learned from our chemistry section, where the salt goes, the water goes. And so we need to be able to concentrate the urine so that all the water comes out and stays in our blood. Otherwise, problems happen. So tubular secretion occurs both within the proximal and convoluted tubule as well as the collecting ducts. This also helps remove waste and excess ions from the blood. So because when we talk about secretion, we move from the blood into the filtrate. And when we talk about absorption, we're talking about from the filtrate back into the blood. As you can see here, the reabsorption of some substances is huge. So water per day, we reabsorb 180 liters of water. Now, I want you to think about this. Do we have 180 liters of water just hanging out in our body? Well, it depends on how much you weigh. That's a whole different subject. But probably not. So why are we reabsorbing 180 liters of water a day? And the answer is because we are filtering all of our blood constantly, consistently, even when you're asleep and not even thinking about it. I mean, I bet you don't even think about it normally about filtering your blood. I mean, I don't. We pull out 180 grams of glucose, urea, creatine, sodium, potassium, bicarbonate. These are all products of cellular respiration and cellular processes that produce these. So the kidney is one of the major regulators of homeostasis. So you know I love it. One of the major regulators of homeostasis in the body. It not only regulates water, which we'll talk about in the next slide, but the main thing that it does is it balances the pH by both absorbing and secreting. Remember, absorbing into the blood, secreting into the filtrate, hydrogen ions. So it returns bicarbonate ions to the blood during tubular reabsorption. So we pull them from the filtrate, put it back into the blood. As well as it can pull excess hydrogen from the blood and put it back into the filtrate. As well, the nephron can generate new bicarbonate ions, which again from the chemistry chapter is a buffer, and it helps our blood maintain a 7.2, 7.4 pH, just happy homeostasis right there. Now, you're thinking to yourself, why would my pH change? Why would I have more hydrogen ions? And this has everything to do with the level of cellular respiration. And as we talked about in the respiratory chapter, the more, and in the muscle chapter, we're tying it all together, the more we ask of our muscles, the more cellular respiration we do. The more oxygen we need, the more carbon dioxide we produce. The more carbon dioxide we produce, that tells us that at a cellular level, we are doing a ton of cellular respiration. When we do a ton of cellular respiration, we also produce a number of hydrogen ions. Now, if we increase the pH in the blood, this also allows for oxygen to be released much faster. It's an amazing and beautiful system, this chemistry. Now, when there are more hydrogen ions in the blood, the oxygen is released to the tissues faster, so that more cellular respiration can occur. Again, then we move the blood to the kidneys, where the kidneys are like, oh, I've got this under control. We're getting oxygenated just fine. We can remove some of these hydrogen ions. And that's when, after a long run or a long series of exercise, you have slightly more acidic pee. You've probably noticed it. We won't go into details right now, though, but you've probably noticed it. Oh, and there's our lovely little nephron. We have glomerular filtration right here at the glomerulus, tubular reabsorption at both the proximal and convoluted tubule, and then tubular secretion. Now, water balance. One of the main things that the kidney does is prevent you from dehydrating, as well as peeing off extra fluid if you ingest it. Do you guys remember when the Wii came out? Like not the Wii as in pee, but we're going to talk about that in a second. Don't you worry. But the Wii as in Nintendo. Okay, that's what it is. Like the Wii as in Nintendo, right? That came out. So this made national headlines because a radio station had a competition that said who could hold their Wii for a Wii. And the goal was to drink as much water as possible and to see who peed first. And whoever peed first lost. And so this lady, it was near Christmas time, bless her sweetheart, she drank, 2 gallons of water in a very short period of time and held her pee and won the Wii. But then within 24 hours, she was dead. You know why? Because you actually physically need to pee that off. You need to release it. And your kidneys can only function so fast. Again, back to our proteins, back to our enzymes. Our enzymes have a max rate at which they can function. And if you put more of anything into your system than your body and your enzymes at the very lowest molecular level can handle, then you have excess of this in your body. All that to say, nephrons, we have these long loops, and this helps us with water resorption as well as removing excess water from the system. So in this instance, this lady put so much more water in her system than was safe. And as we know from diffusion and osmosis, if you put more water in, it will cause hydrolysis of your red blood cells, as well as your cells to expand and explode. And in this case, a lot of her internal organs shut down. They couldn't remove the water fast enough. So we have 3 regions of the kidney. We have the cortex, the medulla, and then we have where these collecting ducts empty into. They empty into the minor calyces, the major calyces, and then that whole thing is called the renal pelvis. And as we move down further into the kidney, it becomes saltier. Now, why would it be saltier in the kidneys? In the medulla of the kidney. Now, in a lot of cultures, kidneys are a delicacy to eat because they are so soft and tender, and just talking about that kind of grosses me out because I am horrible American, that to say. At any rate, so as we move farther down, the concentration of salt becomes higher, which means that where the salt is, there the water goes. And so the water is pulled out into the blood at a much easier pace. This is also why you don't give babies under the age of 1 water in large quantities. You never give babies under the age of 6 months water, period. Because their kidneys aren't salty enough. They're brand new. Their kidneys haven't had to actually filter their blood because they've been using their moms. And so that's why we only give babies formula or breast milk, because they don't have the osmotic power in their kidneys to pull out the excess water if you give them more water. And it can be actually very dangerous. I have a story about that involves Facebook and an argument I got with someone who was undereducated that I'll tell you in class. It's not for the internet. So the whole goal of the renal pelvis and the medulla is to maintain a high solute concentration so you can pull water out, so that we can concentrate the urine. And we have 3 hormones that help us to do this. We've talked about ADH, and we've touched on aldosterone. So let's go into some more detail here. Aldosterone increases reabsorption of sodium. Okay, so if we pull sodium out, we're putting sodium back into the blood. This helps increase the blood volume and pressure. Why? Because where the salt goes, there the water will follow. So as you pull more sodium out into the blood, this actually also pulls water back into the blood. So what's the result? Highly concentrated urine. And this means this is when you have bright yellow pee and you're like, oh, I need to drink some water. Yeah, because you have absorption, you're producing aldosterone at this point, and your body is trying to reabsorb as much water as possible because you're not putting enough into it. Now, this is reduced by the juxtaglomerular apparatus, which is right here between the afferent and the efferent arterioles. Now, here's the distal convoluted tubule, and the JG apparatus is right here, right between it. Now, the brilliant thing about this is when this tiny area right here senses that there is a drop in blood pressure, because a drop in blood pressure means that we're not having as much pressure on the blood coming in through the afferent arteriole. We're not pushing as much out into the glomerulus. So this senses right here and says, oh gosh, I should resorb some sodium so that I can pull water out. And then this has a direct effect on the distal and proximal convoluted tubules as well. It's really cool. And then we have antidiuretic hormone. And we've talked about this ad nauseum in class. This is produced by the hypothalamus, which is then released by the posterior pituitary. And this increases permeability of the collecting ducts to water. So what does this mean? That means that more water is put back into the blood. Now, if you're an adult over the age of 21 and you have ever had an adult beverage, you may or may not have experienced that after 1, maybe 2, drinking responsibly adult beverages, you may have noticed a sudden urge to pee and thought, oh, I don't usually have to pee this much. And then you think about it, but then you just go potty. At any rate, the reason why is because alcohol actually feeds back and inhibits antidiuretic hormone binding. And so if you don't have ADH, we call it ADH blockage. If you have ADH blockage, that means you're not resorbing as much water. And if you're not resorbing as much water, you're going to pee more. And this, in the long run, is going to lead to dehydration, which is what we call the wonderful morning after. I've never experienced this personally. Increased permeability to water collecting ducts allows an increase in blood volume as we put the water back into the blood, as well as concentrating the urine so that we don't dehydrate. And if you have adult beverages, this prevents this process, which causes dehydration. Atrial natriuretic peptide. Now, you may be wondering, hey, atrial sounds familiar. It sounds like the atrium from the heart, and you would be exactly right. It's released from the right atrium in response to an increased blood volume and pressure. So all of a sudden we have a massive amount of pressure coming in the right atrium, which means, so think about what the right atrium is. The right atrium is where all the blood from the body returns. This is from this returning to the heart from the systemic circuit. And then we go to the right ventricle and we pump to the pulmonary circuit. So if we have an increased load on the atria, all of a sudden the heart is like, what's going on? This is so much pressure, what's happening? So it releases ANP, atrial natriuretic peptide. And this helps to decrease resorption of sodium. This helps sodium go out in the pee. So again, where the sodium goes, the water goes. And if the sodium goes out into the pee, so does more water. And this will then decrease the pressure on the right atria, and everything returns back to homeostasis. So urination, I'm sure this is what you've been waiting for. How we pee. You know how we pee? Well, it's a little bit more difficult process than you would actually think. So urination, or micturition, that's the technical scientific term, is the process by which the urinary bladder is emptied. So we make all the urine in the kidneys, we filter the blood, it then turns into urine at the collecting duct. The collecting duct empties into the minor calyx, and then the major calyx, and then the renal pelvis, and it comes out the ureter, and is stored in the urinary bladder until all of a sudden, gotta go! Now, this involves both involuntary and voluntary components. Again, same as with pooping. We have an internal urethral sphincter and an external urethral sphincter. The internal urethral sphincter is involuntary, and it's at this point when a lot of pressure is put on the voluntary external urethral sphincter that you feel the urge to pee, and you find a bathroom. The extraurethral sphincter is skeletal muscle and voluntary, and aren't we thankful? And by now, you should be able to list the organs and systems that eliminate waste, identify and give the function of each of the organs in your urinary system, explain the role of the kidneys in maintaining homeostasis, describe the nephron, the process of glomerular filtration, tubular reabsorption, and tubular secretion, and I didn't mention this in number 3, but also tell me how the hormones affect homeostasis and help maintain that. That's been another lecture with Dr. B. I hope you've enjoyed it. I'll see you next time.